now for 28 years. And one of the things that what made this piece of legislation and ultimately what's happened since it very unique is for years and years and years and years and years, as long as I've been in law enforcement, when the federal government realized that it didn't have all the necessary resources at the local level to address a federal program, what they did is they formed a task force. Okay? Blue Lightning Task Force, that was customs and immigration. I was on that. I used to sit out here at the state docks and we would inspect Chinese ships coming in that were selling illegal goods off the ships. Okay? DEA has had multi-jurisdictional task forces where local officers are deputized and put them into the federal court system. Okay? Using local resources. FBI, Major Crimes Violence Task Force, has utilized local officers to go out and enforce street-level crimes looking for the big heavy hitters to put them in the federal court system. This whole immigration thing deviated away from that. And, you know, it was a situation where I agree the federal government was very lax in what they were doing as far as addressing the problem. And I think that was what our legislature and what they were hearing was that the state of Alabama has to step up and do something to address this problem. One of the unique things about this law, and you know, I'll give the standard disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, okay? But I've had to read more law as it relates to this case than I have any other law in my entire career. This has been my work. This is my desk reference guide to this law, okay? This contains the court's opinions. This contains the modifications and amendments to the law as it worked its way through the legislature. And several other items. And so what it's done is it's forced law enforcement to have to get more involved in this. And we were dealing with an area of law we weren't trained to deal with. We weren't trained to determine immigration status and things of that nature. So, but one of the things Alabama law did, what most people failed to understand, is there was just as much in that telling you what you couldn't do as what you could do. You know, the law specifically stated you can't make a stop based upon the color of their skin or the speech of their mouth. The law specifically prohibited certain things that were provided that you could not do, and it laid out a pattern for what happened. Now, I'm a firm believer that the immigration thing is a federal issue. I'm also a firm believer that the states have the right to enact legislation as long as it, you know, does not superintend and it was a great review for me to go back all over the Supremacy Clause issues and everything else is laid out, but that the states would have the right to protect themselves. I agree with Sheriff Cochran. We're doing the same thing we've always done now. With what the 11th Circuit had ruled, based upon, I think, in somewhat connection with what the Supreme Court did. Essentially what happens is if we arrest somebody on a criminal charge, forget immigration, if they're arrested on a criminal charge and they come to our jail and we suspect them to be illegal, they're going to be checked through ICE. Typically, if ICE has a suspicion, they will come and do an interview within 48 hours. They'll put a detainer for hold, which essentially is whether they're going to make a decision to adopt the case. What we were seeing and where the system has really failed is we had people that were being convicted of crimes that were not being deported. They were refusing jurisdiction in a lot of the cases. If it was a felony, if they're a repeat offender, things of that nature, they may go ahead and adopt that case and do something with it. I guess the other thing that I will say, what's made it difficult for law enforcement is that this kind of was thrust upon us, and so, okay, now we've got a law that we're going to enforce. Well, then the federal government came in, and they essentially wanted to make law enforcement the villain in this case. We were in a meeting right here in Mobile. There's a United States Deputy Attorney General. I'm told he's the number 3 man under Eric Holder. He's head of their Civil Rights Division. His last name is Perez. He came down, Sheriff Cochran and I were literally sitting across the deal from him and basically threatened us and threatened local law enforcement. And said, and in his exact statement, he said, we know that law enforcement is keeping children from entering the schoolhouses in the state of Alabama because of this bill. We know your officers are conducting roadblocks and taking people into custody on immigration. We said, tell us, where's this occurring? What county is this occurring in? Because it sure ain't happening in Mobile and Baldwin County. Well, I can't tell you that. It's under investigation. This was followed by a letter that basically came out of the Department of Justice by Assistant U.S. Attorney Perez that said, by the way, we realize that there's some civil rights issues and everything in Alabama, and has been some of the history of this. And if you choose to enforce this law, understand that we can withhold federal funding. Okay? So we were tagged with probably the removal of federal grants and everything else. All while all we were saying was, if I don't know of any law enforcement officer that, if the legislature passes a law, we're going to enforce the law. I mean, that's what we raise the right hand and swear to do when we take our oath. Okay? And, that's what we got to do. But then they came in and did this, even to the point now, the most recently, is we had started getting some feedback out of Director Napolitano's office through Homeland Security that there may even be a delayed process in removing some of these people.
Once again, let them go then? You can't keep them, right, if there's a delayed process.
Yeah, and this was even the ones that had actually even been
convicted.
Well, they had issued a detainer.
Oh, okay.
And that we would hold them. We haven't seen that. I think there'll be an article in the Mobile Press Register tomorrow. They just recently did a sweep over the past few weeks, and what that is just what was described earlier, where these are people that they reviewed their status, they went and issued federal warrants on them, they went out and picked them up. I think they listed about 38, about half of them are in my jail right now because I am a designated ICE detention facility, and I'll hold them until they take them to Atlanta. Some go to Talladega, but most of the time they go to Atlanta for their final detention. So we are back to where we were. The only provision in the Alabama law is on that situation if they don't have a driver's license. And the question, Matt, being the attorney he is, tell me about this detention. How long are y'all holding detention and everything? Because we're very concerned about that, getting into an illegal detention, which of course, as you well know, can lead to some civil rights issues and can cause you some grief down the road. For me, my officers, if we're doing that, we essentially are following the Terry stop rule. I mean, we're essentially about 20 minutes, okay, if it's nothing. And what do? We let them go. I mean, we document them, who they are, what they are, and everything else. Now, for most of the time, that's not been a big issue with us because we've got either reason to arrest them on a charge, we've got a reasonable thing that we're there. We're not just checking immigration. And that was the thing that really was the misinformation out there about this was that, I'll never forget when it came in, I had a principal of an elementary school come and said, "Sheriff, are you going to come arrest my bus drivers today because they might have an illegal kid on the bus?" My answer was, "Hell no." No, we're not going to do that. I mean, that was just, and a lot of this was being fueled. Last thing I'll say is I do sit on the national committee with this. And of the national committee, about half that national committee are Arizona sheriffs. And we actually call them border sheriffs because they are sheriffs on the border. They are. And folks, I'll just go ahead and tell you, it is a war. I mean, you have sheriff's offices out there that have tactical teams that are on routine patrols in tactical gear, manning them. The president can say all this stuff. If there's more boots on the Arizona border, that's the reason is because it's sheriff's deputies and police officers that are filling those boots. And that's what I'm getting from the sheriffs out there. There are officers being shot at. There are officers being killed. And so that's why this issue's become so passionate for Arizona. One of the cases that's coming up right now, everybody's familiar with, of course, Fast and Furious and the situation that happened out there. But there was also a rancher that was out there, just a John Q. Public, normal guy, citizen that had a farm. And he essentially was riding his fence, checking his areas out there. And some illegals had border crossed illegally, had come across, they had murdered him. And then, realizing they had committed a murder in the United States of America, crossed the border back into Florida to seek immunity for being extradited to come back, and just a whole big issue that they had there. So that's the passions that are coming from Arizona on that. The Supreme Court ruling did not go the way that most sheriffs and law enforcement thought it would go. We were in that meeting in July, right before the Supreme Court issued it. We thought the number was right, but we thought the opinion was going to be different as far as the majority versus the dissent. But it wasn't. And that's kind of where we are. So today, I agree with Sheriff Cochran, we're really just doing things about like we were a few years ago, maybe with a couple modifications. And it's not the locals. You know, I think that they're trying to do the best they can. This is an administration decision policy issue that's being called from Washington, is why we're seeing a lot of this distinction as far as the backup and the issues that we're having with it.